Hello everyone, today we talk about wargaming, and more specifically as a general introduction to two separated topics and multiple ones, but could stick to just two for the sake of simplicity. That is, from one side, properly a criticism to, serious wargaming, the one that was used to be practiced up to a few decades ago, but by a certain scale, by those who were somewhat even just amateurly interested in military history and wanted to try that out. And at the same time, that the portrayal of war in popular culture that, in my opinion, has come very close to, let's say, video gaming in general, right? And video gaming fitting loosely in part into the wargaming narrowly meant I wanted to discuss, like board games, for example. That's what I'm talking about, even with dioramas, little, toy soldiers, I don't know how to say that, but modeling and so on. Why do I address this? Well, because here and there in Schwerpunkt, more back in the day, let's say that recently, I criticized, but not, let's say, systematically, but not in detail, the problem of, let's say, simulation, we could say, and naturally let's say the learning, the lesson we can get from it, for the sake of a scientific understanding of warfare, right? My impression is that war is misunderstood mostly at those levels that try to reduce it to a deterministic system. It's properly a mathematical question, right? It's wargaming is naturally trying to replicate that model, and in a sense, it's there is a paradox in there. That is, of course, the more you increase the variables, the more it should tend to look like reality, because it's more complicated, it's less predictable, right? So it kind of simulates the fact that, as von Clausewitz himself says, objectively war does approach something like a card game, in a sense, because there is a human factor in there that is the decisional one. There is the the randomness of the of what can happen, the cards that can happen. But at the same time, there is the certainty, if you want, of victory and defeat, right? Or at least of a specific outcome that where if one wins, the other loses, or sometimes even worse, in the sense that everybody can lose. But this also has to do with the idea of victory and defeat that we have analyzed recently in a relative sense. But it does render the idea. Von Clausewitz says that war is a game, objectively and subjectively. So one of the elements of the Clausewitzian trinity, that is the most attracted by gambling, right? Literally by the idea that the military, differently from politics, politicians, we could say, and the people, society, is the one that is so in virtue of the bet, let's say, of getting through this thing that we all know, in fact, at that point is unpredictable for it, but still feeling challenged and interested and spotting indirectly, I would say biologically, right, as we have evolved to cope with the world, trying to make sense of chaos, right, even if there can be a failure, right, even if there can be a setback. So wargaming, in a sense, responds to this need, right? We fortunately don't need to start a war every time we want to kind of simulate one. But at the same time, we naturally have to understand the differences, so that when a real war is hopefully not, will have to be fought, hopefully not, but still unavoidably involves history sooner or later, we can maybe learn something about that. So there is a very sharp distinction we can make immediately. The first one is that war pertains to reality in general. That is to say, there is not a specific boundary to it. As we've seen, the Trinity is exactly this thing, that war is all one with politics and society. So what we think, even when there is actual combat and what the military instrument is directed to, still politics and society, we could say, interplay in it, so that there can't be properly a simulation that takes into consideration not just just the military aspect of it would be not calculable properly from a mathematical point of view, because we don't have the capacities. We'll never have, nor mentally, nor even less technically, to ever compute that amount of data in itself. But you can understand that this extends even far beyond war itself. So that kind of niche that you think you're creating when you're putting up there a war game is already by definition not reality, but badly, right? That is the most important things that are going to impact how that thing is going to work are not calculated. Or at least they may be simulated in other ways, but generally speaking, that could be, I don't know, the specific character of a commander, right? That we know historically speaking, so we can attribute to him certain specific traits that came from the political and social background he came from, but in practice, still, we don't calculate much of that political pressure received from home, how society would respond to that situation. So it's something that, right, it's really important. It may seem to be put aside by approximation, but that's exactly the point. It can't be put aside, because especially politics intervenes constantly in every single instant of war, and it can never be excluded, right? So the other mistake that is done there is in fact more, maybe not less conceptual, but still also more important, that there is this attitude that you can see even in programs like, I don't know, Deadliest Warrior, just stuff like that. They start from the assumption that the two contendants, the two duelists, we could say, start from even bases, even capacities. In a sense, they're provided essentially maybe with different armament, but there is this idea that the clash that occurs between the two is fundamentally predetermined, in a sense that it doesn't matter what, these guys have just to kill each other. That's also realistic, in the sense that once that these two guys will, one of the two will realize, and the other accordingly, because this responds also to the laws of reciprocity of war, that specific disadvantage that is invariably to be found, even given absurdly for granted that these people have equal capacities, which it's not even clear what it should mean, right, will not fight, right, because it's not an imbecile, right, by taking away the reason for which these people fight, which is inherent even in their armament, because at the end of the day, Deadliest Warrior is kind of an engineering program, right? It's not properly an historical one. It's stressing things like how much does a sword cut on which material and so on. So that's mostly what the calculation is made on, roughly. And that's also, nobody denies the importance of technology in war, but as we've seen, it's literally one of the least important factors in absolute terms, and also relative terms, telling the truth. Just the broader frame is not very realistic in there, but especially if that's a duel, right? Where's the hate? Where's the reason for which they should fight that is embodied by the same guy, by the same armament, by the same culture that is meant to represent, right? In reality, that asymmetry will, because at the end of the day, that's what the program is wanting you to spot, right? Who's going to win, because there is an intrinsic asymmetry for which somebody's advantage over the other and therefore shall win, ideally. And they give that ideal, but still not considering at all that the other guy from the other side may even make it, in fact, to defeat the guy, because it's not impossible, but still that, if that intrinsic disadvantage would push him to change his way of war, and we know definitely that this is what happens historically at every given second, because war is by far one of the most powerful hybridizers of cultures, of civilizations, and so on. So wargaming starts a bit from the same assumption. That there is a range of options, fundamentally, that already limits the sphere of what can happen, and you have just to obey it. War is nothing like that, right? Just for saying, even though for those who play chess, I must say, with a bit, of venom, because I suck at chess, but so did Napoleon, who thought, for example, that it was a useless game for the sake of war. Objectively, it is, because it's a beautiful game, but I love it myself, even if I'm not good at it, telling the truth. But it's often compared, like saying, if you play chess, you acquire this great strategical thing. No, you don't. It's just, if you want, a very limited, deterministic game that doesn't tell you much about what is even remotely close to war. That is, aside from the game mechanics that, of course, are limited, as we've seen, badly compared to the complexity of reality that is infinitely larger. But how, what it would be like, playing chess, knowing that, I don't know, if you lose one pawn, I destroy your house. And I don't mean it as if, like, I literally destroyed it, and you would, at that point, change a big deal of things, including, your own training, your own capacity, right? And that is exactly what happens in warfare all the time. I mean, it's not anecdotal to stress that the most important factor in war, in relative terms, is moral forces. Right, this is what we get quite clearly from the Clausewitzian theory. What does this mean? We have seen it many times. That fundamentally, in this extremely pressuring situation, is the person who holds on the most that is fundamentally going to make it. And in order to get that, I mean, it's not always like that, right? It's not true, as we've seen, even in absolute terms, because you can be way more determined than your adversary, still being annihilated. See countless examples like that, but I mean tendentially, right? And considering also that in real warfare, asymmetry is usually, which is always present, because war is always asymmetrical. There's never been symmetrical warfare. It's just an invention that doesn't make any sense. But of course there can be more or less symmetrical warfare in that regard, and especially the larger the scale of war is, and the least that asymmetry exists. That is to say, if you go to war, normally, if you decide to resort to violence to solve your political, social problems with somebody else, you fundamentally are, most of the times, this is what history shows dramatically well, first of all, you're hoping to win that, right? So you have to be realistically capable of doing it in a way or another. Wars are, never think that there is the rhetoric of the lost cause that goes on very like, those guys were brave, romantic heroes who fought to death even if they were doomed. No, history is almost never like that. And there's always a margin in the complexity and unpredictability of warfare for that victory to happen. And even here, teleological and deterministic readings of history are wrong. Right? If you need to explain the maximal systems of the world, of course it comes handy to make these generalizations. But warfare is something that obliges you to reason in the exactly opposite direction, because it doesn't work anything like that. And the more you study it, I mean, we all realize that history has been taught to us weirdly, to say the least. Right? If you think that learning history is what your family told you or your school taught you, it's not going to be a great starting point to assess how complicated that really is on average. Not that certain families or certain schools are not good at teaching history, but let's say that there is a reason why we study history more in detail, and especially military history provides us this kind of realization, right? Because it poses us in front of a system that is so pressured that even a small variable can cause unimaginable changes. Right, and this is truer in warfare than basically in any other human activity. So that's literally the other, the least possible situation. Let's say let's say a predictability is going to happen. Also, I don't remember where I was going with this, but let's say yes, with the asymmetry and the fact that if you go to war, chances are because you hope to win, but you're also it's something so risky for the fate of your own people, your own country, that you have to have a hell of a good reason for doing it. And even this concept, this dialect, let's say this phraseology, is already very difficult to make understood to people, because if you are taught since you're a kid that, I don't know, in a war there was just an evil person that decided that, and all the others are poor scapegoats of a massive structural misfunctioning due to human stupidity, just know that this is not real, right? Because societies do not move, fortunately and unfortunately, just for the evil guy at the top, but they move as something that is also barely controllable in that regard, and because of every and each one's responsibility. So this disgusting, I'm sorry to use this adjective, but so it is, rhetoric of the poor soldiers who were sent to war by someone else, right? That after all, we're just fellow humans who love each other. No, it's not true. We know that human nature is pretty damn messed up. Yeah, that it can be very good people, but we can also be very bad ones all at once. And there is not the angel and the devil that tells, and makes you good or bad according to, what a moralistic judgment of the hour can become more trendy. Right? If you start from this standpoint, you already failed badly at, personal responsibility, morality, understanding, and it's definitely not flattery for your own intelligence, to say the least. But it, on the contrary, proves the point that humans are pretty messed up by themselves. So speaking of this picture, this is quite fascinating because honestly, I like. I've never played Wargames, and let's now objectivize what I'm talking about here. To me, wargaming is this world that I've seen at distance because ever since I was a kid, when there were the old adults, say, from a kid's perspective, that played this kind of complicated, so serious, right? It looked so, I visited some museums, some expos, some all these dioramas-based things, and then I was fascinated by it. I brought home the various booklets, listening to all the airplanes, the tanks, the soldier types. I was fascinated with that. And I look at these guys playing these major board games, and with dioramas, with the actual battlefield replicated on scale. It was very fascinating. Every time, even just I went on museums, I loved to watch those things. I even talk about this thing, something I wrote myself. So I must confess that aside from what anything this video can turn out, I think there is a very positive nature attached to these things, orientatively speaking, because if that stimulates a kid's mind to be creative, to be insightful, to be curious, to be interested, especially in history, so it's something real, right? And that's the concept there, the accuracy, the realism, the authenticity, if you want, right? That around which the wargaming thing revolves. Well, if that's a booster for further development along that pattern, but in the right direction, that's fine, right? The problem is that most people, and that's the realization I come to at this point, that revolve around these worlds, but I must say not them specifically, but let's say the average person that comes to revolve, even if it's dragged in, right, instinctively and just intuitively, doesn't quite get the point, right? I've met people who legitimately said, we've played so much wargaming on historical research and base for us to be better than the actual military were there to be a war, right? And we were put in charge, right? I've heard like this kind of bullshit, and there are a lot of people who are convinced of that, right? Pick me, like I'm a military historian. I think that I'm, I have a valid understanding of warfare, but I've studied it just theoretically and practically at the point of realizing that knowing these things has properly nothing or barely anything to do in the first place with being, first of all, a capable commander in the first place, right? So let's take out of the way the idiocy that by playing war games you acquire some great strategical understanding, because that has nothing to do. The wide majority of people, just by nature, mental, psychological predispositions, cannot bear what war is in positions of command, which is something, it's like a gigantic boulder on your head, to say the least. And if you don't have certain specific characteristics, nerves, cold blood, coup d'oeil, intelligence, but also moral reason, you don't go anywhere. Right, the myth of the warrior, also the individual fighter we'll talk about in the latter phase of the video, that's another bullshit, right? You being more or less predisposed to go out and kill somebody for maybe even reasons that are, you remained orphan, you had to take care of your family since an early age, that's true, right? But that doesn't tell you, that can make you a good fighter, but it doesn't tell you even, if you don't even know platoon tactics, you go nowhere in terms of command. right? And that's just something complex and complicated enough, and just think of what it can be an army corps in which situation and how to handle it. So the wargaming I'm talking about, yes, is mostly that one, right? And wargaming, as far as I understand, because I never got in it personally, passion. I've seen some war games, let's say, because there are different types. I was fascinated by the, let's say, the serious ones that tend to replicate mostly certain strategical, tactical scenarios. And there are others that are simpler. For example, I like very much the ones that present you with multiple options. We could say, well, but those are simple because they don't require much of a preparation. They're not actually simpler, in the sense that even if they give you a few options, and if they focus on the decisional process, that puts you in, and if they're done naturally by military historically competent people, that puts you in front of like questions you can't dodge, and that they are the most important ones, right? That is, attack or defense, do this or that. I mean, and we're talking about major decisions, and if you screw up that, you're basically not good at it, right? Not even by elementary military logic, by a certain degree. Where's the trick in here? The trick is pretending that growing competent on the details, that is, on the factors that you can add to the wargaming, such as, I don't know, you plan a battle, to reconstruct a battle, and you focus on the very slight detail of every single soldier type and how it was, and you try to calculate the statistics of the weapons and all these things that, of course, by themselves have also basically nothing to do, as we're saying, for reality, if you don't consider moral forces, which sometimes are considered, but usually are considered in these games, I presume. I mean, it could be at least the fatigue. That is also considered, and so on. So it's very important. I'm not saying that they're badly done, right? But if you think that at the end of the day, the focus you have to maintain is on those details, and you even come close to think that, no, let's say, getting used to reasoning with all those details at once will necessarily bring you, or better, those details altogether will necessarily bring you to understand the commanding capacity, you're out of track. Why? Because a command and post is exactly in a situation that is over these things. That is something an NCO on the field will have to take care of for his own unit, right? If you're a commander-in-chief, you have to calculate these things just by the sheer practice of all those men moving together. Because when war is going to happen, first of all, those parameters, doesn't matter how detailed they are, they're enormous and infinitely more complicated than they actually are. There's no way to sort out how things will go. So the only practical, you can have a kind of a broader idea of what could be like, but you never be sure. And this is the point, because there is a positivism in there that says, if I know them, I know how it will go, more or less likely. Yes, but the point is that if you focus on that, you lose track of the idea that still will go differently, right? From whichever you thought it could go. So what actually makes an expertise, an experience, a capacity to do better is to theory, command for real. Right, so first of all, stepping into the field of reality, not of games, and secondly, repeating that over and over and over again. Because even if you think that's so overly complicated, even if you can mathematically calculate the infinite possibilities can happen on that game, still, that's ever less simple than what reality is going to be. And there are just two fields, essentially, that can help you with that. War games, simulations can work. I mean, there have been great experiments made by wargaming and applied to reality that they're very famous, right? Some of the most famous ones are the British ones against, during World War II. There are many, right? And wargaming is something that even just through simulators is done, and so on. I even played with programs that were used by the military to train tank crews, and they're objectively very realistic in their own way. But at the same time, you realize that doesn't matter how close certain details are to reality, the basic mechanisms that you're trying to replicate there can work for a very limited range of, let's say, meaningful options. That is to say, let's leave aside that from the individual perspective there, you're mostly projected, and here we're talking about video games proper, into an individual, and therefore extremely narrow point of view, right? You're rarely in charge of at the top, right? And even in those video games where that happens that are more strategical, still let's say the simplification is greater, because at the end of the day, it reduces the factors that maybe an FPS would present you with more realistically in a sense, and that are confined, however, to a much narrower space. Strategy games normally do not even consider those, right? And we all know by friction that even a small incident in war can generate enormous changes. Like, this is theory of games. And it's something that is recognized, and also from a military historical point of view, right? Before these theories were even objectivized as such. So, in a way or another, this presents you with the main difficulties that wargaming brings you to. In this sense, yes, I mean, those simulators that give you the essentially an individual perspective, like a pilot, like a ground soldier, even as a crew, can show you interestingly, in an interestingly accurate way. I'm not saying that accurate means I mean how it's really gonna be, but they surely come closer to reality. The problem is that they come closer to realities that are virtually insignificant on average, because whether it's the destiny of one soldier in a large-scale warfare is literally infinite. So that presents you with the same difficulties that von Clausewitz actually discusses in the Filmkrieg. That is, you as a single mind do not have much other mean to hope to understand warfare, but basically putting yourself at the highest level of the hierarchy and starting practicing with actual command, and integrating that hopefully with military history, because they are somewhat homogeneous in nature, because they both study what happened in a real event. They're not reconstructing history like in a war game on the base of a system that is already flawed. History, with all the limitations of sources and evidence, is based on what actually happened. So if you interpret things accurately, you can get close to something that at least happened for real, right? And it's not invented from scratch, just by a guy's mind, how to replicate an infinitely complicated system to a bunch of variables that doesn't matter how many they are and how complicated these games are. Hell, some of these games manuals are like entire books, right? So you have to study them for a lifetime in order to make things work, to know everything by heart. But still, that's the pedantry that von Clausewitz talks about by saying, if you pretend that that's how we should interpret warfare, you're already lost, because you don't have the time to do that in real life. You don't have the time to get used to a deterministic system that you're going to find best solutions for, because reality in war is changing constantly, fast, and unpredictably, in ways that either you take control of the situation, that practice with reality, not with a fake version of reality, or you go nowhere. Right, so the actual capacity of command there is not proven by a war game. It's not simulated properly by a war game, but not even closely. Right, what war games in that sense are useful, are the historical research that lays behind the thing, because that is in fact properly based, should be at least on real events. Right, so if you play a war game that is based, I don't know, on the Battle of Zama, Well, if you studied Second Punic War in the meanwhile from actual sources, and by the way, not just from what wargamistic manuals, that is something written by someone else, that may present with information, but still, having its own bias there, and you should check the sources first, is a beautiful exercise. I know many wargamers that actually did this. Some who even had, in fact, an important historical competence by themselves, and that therefore understood better what certain factors could be about. Yes, but doesn't matter how expert you are, still that game, it sounds banal to say it's not reality, because everybody understands it's not reality, but not everybody, and actually very few people, understand the scale by which that is not reality. That is very large, right? And it can't be excused for that. For the rest, I can't say that. The same goes for strategy. Strategy, on the other hand, has another advantage. I mean, strategic war games probably are the ones I would personally like best, right? Because, playing with toy soldiers, in a battle, it can be very cinematographic, very visual, very, very fascinating. But objectively, strategic war games kind of they're also that, as we've seen, that grossly simplified at the point that they do not correspond to actual good mechanics. I've to actual real mechanics. I've heard very good things, for example, about the war game Civil War, about American Civil War, that I was told by an expert person on military historical grounds. It doesn't represent what actually, by scale you understand. If you know the history of American Civil War, it didn't happen like, not the events, but the possibilities, of course, that by scale, by mechanisms, it didn't work quite like that, right? Armies, I don't know because I haven't played the game, but it's as if armies were either overpowered compared to the actual capability. I mean, that's how the game was set. But at least it focused on certain choices that were, and the decisional processes is crucial, that bring you eventually to make sense in a strategical situation, because the strategical situation, paradoxically, is more difficult to simulate accurately, but at the same time, it's let's say it presents you with less choices. This is another thing that people misunderstand along this pattern, that the fact that tactics is objectively easier to understand than strategy doesn't mean that strategical choices by themselves are more complicated than tactical ones. It's quite the opposite. What actually happens in real war is that the pressure posed on as we've seen, on the higher command, so at a strategical level rather than a tactical one, is ever greater. So the problem there is not actually what the option, spotting the option, but actually understanding whether that's the right one or not, because of scarcity of information, because you don't know. Let's be honest about this. Von Clausewitz says it very clearly. 3/4 of what you would need reasonably, say scientifically even, to make a positive decision in war are unknown at all times, right? So the problem at this strategic level is not, let's say, something that can be literally as banal as attack or defend, but whether what's the right option between those two, because it's 50-50, and it stands between the annihilation of your country and victory for the other side. So it's obvious that it's such a high bet that even by odds of 50%, you're not willing to take so easily, right? But for that matter, the broader choice is really easy, right? It's just like blue pill or red pill, right? It's just that you don't know what's the outcome, and the bet is so high that is where all the problem, the moral forces and this crushing responsibility that our commander has, that, believe me, is not, it sounds harsh, but it's not necessarily better sometimes in human terms than literally getting shot on the front line, right? Even if the commander-in-chief is somewhere sitting on a chair distant from the front, right? it can be far more torturing in a sense, even much more disruptive for a person's future than actually being killed. Um, that's what nobody likes to understand, because I don't know, with this thing, especially started from World War the First. The generation of this distrust towards command, towards the broader logic of war that naturally the average person doesn't understand, even though it's fairly simple in itself, right? That commanding is difficult, and that's exactly the point, and that tells you how low the average military logical understanding is in our world. Our world, that is the one that is fundamentally still in charge of enormously important things. So don't even think for a second that these are simple things that by practice can be acquired for the practical use, as we've seen so easily, if a country, for example, is not used to that specific military culture, because no country in the world has, right? No country in the world has an intrinsic combativity, strategical understanding. We are all basically far below what we should be, right? And military history, generally speaking, shows that pretty well, right? I mean, look at World War II. It wasn't even one country was even remotely close to be prepared to that. And also, that's how sometimes myths are invented, like that we have to justify what we don't understand by, for example, over-evaluating someone's military capacities and underestimating somebody, while the thing is enormously more complex and would require a bit of years of studying before even starting to realize the essentials in a concrete sense, right? And you understand that if you have gone across YouTube, you have surely found these debates like you wish you had found these debates. But you have found people, I mean, you have sensed probably the degree, the scale of this delusion, this collective delusion. This has spread mostly, I don't know for older generations, but having seen a huge amount of younger or even mature people, but still in there, not really, maybe the older ones, that interacting on the internet, you can get the sense of the scale of how that realistic awareness is completely out of sight. Speaking of video gaming, I would tell you that I've done more than war gaming. According to the difference I've told you before, it's actually the same thing. As long as there is a game that is based on war, that's a war game. Let's say board games, that more complex stuff, from which also, I must say, very good material came from, right? Certain war gamers guides included an astonishingly accurate historical research, right? It once again has very few to do eventually what the game is going to be about, right? You don't have to get exalted about that. You can be very historically competent, but for the same reason for which you may not have specifically military historical education, you may not understand why a war game is flowed along the pattern we've tried to explain today. But that is what you should start from, and it can be extremely useful because it has usually an encyclopedical aim. That is to say, every kind of trooper you may want to find for that era, you can more or less spot its qualities there. Some war games guides are based there with some numerical values based on the kind of defensive capability based on, I don't know how, with which weapons they're equipped. That's garbage in my opinion. I mean, that can give you, well, okay, no, it doesn't, because even if you just study the physics of weapons, it's something so complicated that you realize it can't be framed along those patterns. But when you find those lists where there is actually an historical information that doesn't, reason like an engineer, but like a historian, right? Gives, that source says that, and then we have this archaeological event. Okay, there we can start reasoning, and hopefully not playing too much war games, but actually studying more history, which is the most beautiful war game you can ever find out there. I mean, if you're thrilled about actual wargaming, you want to see study history. Don't play war games, right? Because those are, the more you know history and the more they disappoint you. And that's exactly the point, right? Speaking of video gaming instead, as I was saying before, given that I've played certain strategical war games, and I was a bit strategy there disappointed me than tactics, indeed. Tactics instead, I mean, you can notice the stupid things of even of FPS games. Like, for example, I loathe Call of Duty. It's one of the worst, in my opinion. You can't, everybody will tell you that, obviously, that, I don't know, that, for example, the Arma series, Operation Flash, those are kind of better stuff than usual, because they're based on actual simulators, and those who created those were mindful about certain episodes. But, I mean, you can easily understand there that the most important factor, that is artificial intelligence, is not like, okay, you can play with humans, but even in there, how many of those humans that are fighting are actually pressured by the idea that if they get killed in game, they're gonna die in reality as well? Because that would change all the game, that you will never see on servers. Like, you will see something absurd. Where's fatigue there? Where's broader things that can't go wrong that the game doesn't simulate, right? So those are the most banal things, but believe me, the moral one, that is to say, the reason, the motivation for which you're there is the most important. At the same time, however, these video games do focused on the individual perspective can give you, for example, a very good understanding, I would say, if those things are properly calibrated, things like weaponry, vehicles. I must say, I acquired a certain legitimate culture about World War II planes, that by playing certain simulators that were objectively okay, yeah, maybe even in there, of course, they're not realistic as we mean. I mean, some of them actually were, because some are bad. Like, if you play, I mean, there are also very popular games now on the internet. Those are a bit approximated. Some stuff was very well done. I mean, it wasn't the same pattern of Microsoft Flight Simulators that I also played sometimes, that there are how they train pilots, how some certain people to fly planes, even for negative purposes, actually train themselves effectively on, because that's more or less the thing, right? And this were very fascinating. So they give you the technical understanding. Then what is going to happen in reality, they won't tell you precisely, but given sometimes there is really that pressure in the game, that mess that is randomly happen, and that it turns out that even just from a psychological point of view, that's what fascinates most players, right? It's not like hysterical families cried in the 80s and the 90s about children becoming violent because playing video games. It's completely wrong. Actually, video games do stimulate enormously a certain type of intelligence that is mostly the spatial one, certain thing, but also they can make you reflect on what it means, how difficult it is to make it out there. I personally, I'm dreadfully fascinated by those games. By the way, you can create complete missions out of your own thing, and I've played for a long time that stuff, and I must tell you, they're very fascinating. Sometimes now I don't have much time for it anymore since I'm here, but those 5-10 minutes a day just to vent some anxiety at a time. Yes, I do want to shoot down those targets, but the fascinating thing there is even in the repetitivity, for example, of a single mission, the prearranged ones, you see there that no mission, this is the beauty of it, that really maybe gives you something, as all war games do at the end of the day. That is, how things can become messed up in a reality that is going to even be worse than that. But let's say we're talking about matters of millimeters of how you get shot, right? But the whole thing that's going to happen, and that is interesting, because I repeat, at an individual level, that is the least important in war, unless you're not in positions of command in higher hierarchies. That is, however, what actually happens, right? And that shows you how unpredictable even something produced by a machine that is still deterministically showing you something can become. I've always been very fascinated like that, because there are things that happen that are also weird. That is, in the average thing that happens, right? In the hundreds of kills you can see, there is one every once in a while that really strikes you for how bizarre and unusual, but still it was produced and it technically can't happen in reality, like, right? There are certain episodes, at some point I will tell you, of incredible almost things that you can't properly even replicate if you want in the same game, right? That gives, if it is programmed like it gives you the depth of it in a certain sense, and you can measure it, right? And also the powerlessness in front of this unpredictability, that is very important for warfare. That is, you can't be all tactically focused and equipped and expert and so on. You will die in the most stupid ways most of the time, which is exactly what happens like in reality, right? You can't make a bloodbath by taking out 50 enemies at once. What hell result? Then you, at close range with extreme risk and so on, then getting shot by a rifle 300 meters away that you didn't even know was there, and that being a great shot with a single one and you're dead, right? That's it. Speaking, however, of a risk that has become, in my opinion, unavoidable given the mass spread of video gaming, especially of FPS, and this individual perspective, is the video gamization, we could say, in visual terms, of, I would say, movies mostly, right? Or at least, entertainment. I mean, every time war is depicted on screen. And here, I'm a great cinema lover, in a sense. And I must say that, to me, especially from the 2000s, I mean, there were great movies at the time, they stopped, right? Especially in warfare, they all wanted to copy badly Saving Private Ryan, making the same exact cliches, the same exact frames. Cheap movies, because sometimes they don't have the money, but even the supposed realistic ones that make this short, movies on, it happens, you see on the internet. I mean, let's be honest, they're all freaking alike. The guy that checks for cigarettes, that is surprised. There are certain cliches, that the timid young man that falls into this ambush and has to struggle over it, as if warfare was just that, right? Never make a movie about strategy, because people wouldn't understand that, right? But no, you always have to make the same exact scene, the same exact character, the same exact theater, by the way, the same exact situations that are objectively boring, right? And they keep making this stuff, right? Even movies of a certain dimension. And here we're talking, the worst about this is that it's so dramatically homogeneous, first of all. Secondly, this is the way war is being told at all levels. That is to say, every meaningful military topic we could cover now is covered like that. If I watch a movie about the American Civil War, is basically like that. If I watch one about World War II, it's basically like that. If I watch one about Afghanistan, it's basically like that. They're all alike. They all copy each other. They have the same patterns, the same storytelling. There is no and they're also not very interesting, telling the truth. Even the same way of shooting the scenes is always, they don't give you even the tactical depth of that act. They don't show you what's going on. They say, oh, well, because that's exactly what in war is. You don't understand what is. No, it's not true. If you look at how average combats are fundamentally like, even in those situations, there is a kind of a tactical understanding, logic dimension that you can recreate, and that simply movie makers do not understand, do not care about, because they just think to legitimately, right, to cash, and even just by making that cliche scene, right, around which even trailers or spoilers and so on revolve around, in that you can find pieces on the internet, because the rest of the story is also pretty lame, or maybe would be maybe even interesting, but the public is not interested in it, and that's exactly the question. So they don't even invest on it as a consequence. So yes, it does suck on average as well. Why? Because it seems to me that those are perfect copies of video games, of FPS shots, right? That's what they ultimately are. They want to make people that are today in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, basically vent themselves with this kind of adrenaline shots that reminds them of their youth video games, and making them, and entice them in a sense, attract and saying, yeah, I know because I've played those video games too, right? So realistic. And then they don't even know what those dynamics we talked about before, of actual tactics, of actual command really are, which are not even so difficult to represent in a sense, because there are movies that kind of showed something at least deeper. I'm not saying realistic, because there is a movie, first advice, there's no movie that represents war as it is. There's not. Right? Not even if you actually shot a scene of real war, you would actually understand deeply what it is. You could see certain things, how they work, but the broader sense, the broader grasp, and that actual military logic and capacity and understanding, until you don't actually command or study military history in parallel, you can't fundamentally get. Right? There are problems in here, because I suspect that many people don't even have, for example, as much of a spatial kind of, sense of orientation, geographical knowledge. They can't read maps, right? I don't know. I navigated my father across all Scotland when I was 14 by car, and I never missed one. Well, actually, once we did. We ended up in a beautiful bay, but that was it. Right, hundreds of kilometers. That was the only mistake. Ask a kid now is used to go out just with a smartphone in hand and telling him where to go, where they can't orientate themselves so great. I mean, some can, of them, indeed. I mean, most people can orientate themselves in place they know, but just even, the understand, the coup d'oeil of reading a map, right? A military one, for example, the one with actually military information, the military is provided with briefings for actually carrying out an action. You look at if they can read it, or if they can't project their mind, they can't replicate in their mind with a visual imagination what it could be like to be there to eventually act, because that's what real challenges the military is presented with, as a matter of fact. And certain things do not quite change, because it's not that through satellite maps or 3D stuff or infrared, you can't teach properly a person to have that kind of intelligence. That's just, in fact, the technical, artificial factor that is a bit in parallel, the one you try to search when you try to insert different factors in Wargames rule. Reality is something enormously more complex than that, so you have to get used the person to the actual reality itself, right? This is something that really is being missed at a mass level in a disconcerting way, considering we're in the third millennium, so people should be at least a bit more insightful, right, habituated to make a mental effort. I'm not saying the problem is technology in itself, because I believe that technology should actually provide you with the tools to calculate even ever more deeply what you really want to. Here, the fault is not technology. The fault is people's laziness that say, well, okay, technology will do it, and then do not realize that technology will make like a 5% of it, and then the rest is, for which it's virtually insignificant for the world picture, right? What did I want to say about this as well? The same goes for those series that pretend now to be ever more realistic in terms, for example, of ancient medieval warfare that, even lots of kids having played things like Rome Total War like that at the time got fascinated by, and that's why they start making movies for. Always be consistent with this. If somebody makes a movie today, most of the times it's because they want to just make money out of it. So they are going to search for you as a target to design their content on. They don't give a fuck about accuracy or realism. They're not interested in it. They're not competent. They don't even know where to start, right? I listened to some German reenactors that had talked with some friend of theirs that had been questioned, that worked in a museum, in my opinion, that had been interviewed by the producers of those who made that series of Netflix. Was the one about the Battle of Juniper Forest. Came out last autumn, if I'm not wrong. That sucks badly, and of course these reenactors were very disappointed by it, and they said that basically these producers made questions were pretty silly, which is normal, because if you're not an expert, if you're not a historian, if you're not a curator, if you're not an archaeologist, of course you're even certain things like zero, right? But that product is out there, and lots of people are going to watch that, and lots of people are going to have a complete mismatching with reality in that sense. Even, yes, the historical one, and here I could make a much more powerful criticism, because to me, when I watch a military, like when I watch an historical movie, which I often do, actually it's my favorite, as you understand my kind of, I watch that not for how realistic it is. You would be surprised by it. Of course, I have maybe an eye that says, okay, this is not the thing, but I search for the artistic quality, the artistic value, right? When I watch a movie, I know it can be, I know it's very fake always, but I would say, secondly, I realize what that entails practically. Even just, I wonder, how did they make this scene? Because I'm interested in the technicality of those, of the fiction, right? But more broadly, I like a movie if it leaves something within me, if it makes me feel in a certain way, if it gives me some emotions. That's to me an artistic value of sort. These movies today suck. Like, they're disgusting. They're not beautiful stories. They're all cliches. I don't like them. I mean, there is some movie out there every once in a while that does strike me. I must tell you, I was very skeptical sometimes. But for example, when I watched Jojo Rabbit, this is not about military history proper, but it's still about war in a sense. That is as a movie that I can't say in years and years and years struck me. And the reason why it struck me is because it's a beautiful story, and talks about love and hate and discrimination and fear and mental, challenge. I mean, it's really and it does have a historical setting, right? And it's kind of a childlike story because it's also meant to be told from the perspective of a kid, but it's something that struck me deeply. And I don't give a damn if it's the whole thing is realistic in a sense, because still the movie is good. Right? The same goes for military historical content. But the problem there is when they make a movie that is going to excite, let's say, that has the potential, let's say, because I feel this as a historian. Then, of course, everybody can do whatever they want. And I criticize them because, here we can criticize after all. That they have the potential, and we're talking about of actual money, to show something, maybe even with less means, that would be much more realistic and accurate, given the historical knowledge that every military historian, even those that are not maybe that great much, can have today. And they will not do it. And the worst about this is that these movies are often done with the aim of concentrating on those scenes, right? Look at The King, look at, which was that one with Robert Bridges, I mean, the recent allegedly realistic ones that are not realistic at all. Because it's not that if you pick a reenactor that tells you how, guys were, dressed more or less, by the way, at this time, because, the reenactor there is not fully in charge of the thing. There's still the producer, whoever manages the thing, that has something to say, that you make even, something real. I'm not an expert in those things, but I surely would have done better. I'm not really bragging about that, but I mean to give a sense of a certain atmosphere, of a certain action. That's like one of the factors that you want to insert in Wargames to make it more real. You think that the detail is it, but you miss the most important dynamic, right? I don't know what they were. I think I don't know what they were representing in that battle, like Loudon Hill, um, but it was like Bannock. But I don't know. They mix a bit the battles in that sense. But for example, that there is that cavalry charge in Outlaw King. Yes, that was the one about the Scots. That it's many people say, ah, well, it's the closest we have had so far in fiction to reality. I don't know, but first of all, that sucks, right? That's not a cavalry charge. It didn't work like that. They didn't charge with those ranks. There was an avalanche of people throwing themselves into ditches and so on. The guys who waited for them, like the infantry, were kept in a ridiculous way. Were not a raid. They didn't they also this thing that you can see also in Vikings. They want to see these guys bumping up, like moving all maskily, and waiting for a cavalry charge, maybe having just an axe in their hands and not even a freaking mail armor. Just to show kind of a punk adolescence, I would say, teenage emotionalism about what war should be about. This is what it's becoming like. Like, shootouts. That there is not, for example, a single, even normal movie, I would say, that can be a thriller or anything, that in which there's not the spectacular shootout that is also dramatically realistic, by all means, and that, however, has to show this, to fake this, because they can't make it. They don't contextualize it. They don't give it the right dimensions. Emotionalism of the characters that make you understand, you see that character is really suffering. Yes, but it's not, first of all, a real person wouldn't suffer like that. It would be far worse, or however, happening with also different kind of patterns, behaviorally speaking, psychologically speaking. Of course, you can't hire a specialist every time you have to make a scene. But at the same time, when you make a product that is meant to educate, so an historical one that for which there is an audience that expects, you could do better. Yeah, I know you just want to cash, and you know that people will be tricked and fooled by that, and they will pay money to you. But still, you had the chance to do something better with a ridiculous effort, right, that might have been even less than the one you actually made for making the movie. And you lost that. And people will not remember you because they will pay this thing for Netflix for 3 months, and then you're lost. Nobody will remember you. That's why also actual cinema was freaking well done before, right? Why, for example, do we like a movie like Gladiator? I mean, it's irrealistic, but badly realistic. But we love it because it was a kind of a good movie. It inspired. It gave something. It wasn't meant to tell people, look, here we are the competent guys that want to show you how it really was. It's just a story, and a hell of a good story, and that's why we liked it at the end of the day. Even people who got bumped up by the initial scene, by the gladiatorial fight, because at the end of the day, it's just a great story, right? Why do we like Saving Private Ryan? It's a hell of a beautiful movie. It's very well done, technically speaking, exceptionally done. It's also a very beautiful story. A very, very beautiful pictures, right? Before the realism, what we like there is, wow, look at these scenes. Yes, they're a bit like in chunks because the scenarios were, those 4 or 5 scenes there, but they were very they were very powerful. The story was very powerful. Black Hawk Down, that's another beautiful movie. It's not very extremely realistic, telling the truth, but it still gives you something that goes beyond that. Well, they stopped making movies like that. They're all just a cliche repeating itself over and over again. This is my opinion, and I can't say, that one has to agree with me, because otherwise is an idiot. But as you know, I'm not a moral relativist, and therefore I care about what people see in certain things because they may get something wrong that can cause literal problems to society, in a sense. And it's simply, and the reason why quality sucks, by the way, it's not that we lack artists, geniuses, and so on. The problem is fundamentally the market of it. Right? If you understand the economical mechanics behind these movies, that you realize more or less they also tend to all imitate each other. I mean, they blended everything. in the genres as well, as we were saying before. There's always action at a certain level. There have been all these not sequels, but rather that they stopped to do now that like the great classics. They all resumed and they all ruined them because, of course, they had nothing better to do. But up to the years 2000s are beautiful movies. I'd say, I don't know, The Man in the Iron Mask. Like, it can be, you know, I don't know, by some, maybe a simple move, right? But I don't know, maybe because I was grown with Three Musketeers in my library and I love them so much, but, you know, that gives some emotions. There are beautiful scenes, the story's somewhat moving. I mean, there are those kind of, yeah, it's a bit adolescential as well, but still, artistically speaking, to me, it's well done. It's a movie that I always watch with pleasure. I know that that's not actually 17th century France, but it makes me feel a little bit like that. And if I knew more about 17th century France, probably I would like it less. I give you that, right? So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the inspiration there is everything, but I can tell you some movies do not inspire me by the slightest. Or at least they can't be even compared to these ones by scale. And there is a trend, a pattern here that I get confirmed every freaking time. So what's the consequence here for military history? The consequence is that we're not educating. We stopped doing that. Right, you watch a movie like Gettysburg in the 90s, and you could be critical of it because there were things that were objectively not. Of course, they couldn't portray just even all the various actions that happened during those days and so on. But let's say that you watch that movie, you get very inspired to know more about the American Civil War because it was fantastic. Even some small scenes, some cuts, think about the 7 Years' War in Berlin and so on, they were wrong as well, yes, but they gave you something. They were punching sequences, and you kind of loved them. I don't know. This is my opinion. We could do so much better for the masses, but these masses are losing the capacity to educate themselves. I like to compare this to like the third century crisis. When there is a crisis of some sort, masses become poorer, more emotional, more managed, more framed, more controlled, and they're told what they should believe in, that is ever less critical, in a sense, ever less autonomous. I don't like this kind of criticism in the sense that I don't believe this is actually the case in the world, but I'm speaking from a Western perspective. I think we are losing much of the qualities that provided us with an autonomous critical skill. Right? And I'm not saying that in the past was brought us to necessarily reflected better situations, but let's say it's like the board gamers before. Today, say mostly mature, kind of even old people that did those things when they were younger. Right. As far as I know, there was an interesting revival, I think, in the 70s, the 80s. And that's what those guys kind of grew, they're interested with. Today, even that model doesn't quite exist anymore. People get interested in warfare, they mostly video games and this kind of clips on the internet, and they have lost the critical capacity to even do what a board gamer would do. Let's say, okay, let's set the standards, let's set the structure, let's make our mind work. Now we don't want to make our mind work anymore. We want just to, even like in a video game, pull a trigger, make a mess, and not thinking about anything. I know, it's all about the scene. It's just the effect, right? And no application, no mind provocation, we could say. What are we going to do then? Where does this lead to? Probably at some point there will be the reevaluation, naturally, of what we already know. I'm sure at some point we will reevaluate von Clausewitz in mass culture because it's unavoidable. Right? Unless we wipe out civilizations, if we forget everything, about before. But let's say certain things never change. Why, if you want to repeat that, you are essentially, if you want to simulate that, you choose paths that you haven't even searched for, seeing if whether they have been already crossed, and why don't you improve on them? Why don't you realize that we can do things better? I don't see that better. I see an illusion of people who get focused on details and exchange them for the complex, for the whole, as a sign that things are going better. In war, this thing would make you lose, right? And we are losing because that reflects, broadly speaking, other aspects of our culture in which we are doing pretty bad, right? And that is, in my opinion, worth considering, right? And we will talk more about. I know I'm a bit critical. Let's be honest. Today, I didn't even digress on certain other types of simulation. For example, I have problems with. For example, that individual perspective sometimes make us totally forget something that is the most fundamental aspect in warfare is collective dynamics, collective training, right? Even certain forms of reenactment that actually are what we get closer to simulating, in fact, reality in that pattern. Maybe you can find a person extremely competent in HEMA from an individual point of view, but then already if you ask him to know how to line up a unit and how this is gonna work on the field, say 100 men, they just don't know where to start. And what are you actually studying, right? If actually armament fancy was designed on those patterns, right? And even in there, however, you won't find people who actually want to kill each other to test up to which point people are, how that is going to make a difference on the field. So that the interest on a specific detail on an arm or a weapon on an arm may be that insignificant, because history has taught us pretty damn well that when you want to kill your own opponent, it doesn't even matter what you have in your hands, as long as it works, right, at that moment, or you make it work, by the way. And that's exactly the point we want to make here. But again, if you're not presented with this perspective, you're not presented with the desolating and apparently disheartening realization that in front of reality we're nothing, and that we have to find a way through, and we don't absolutely dominate reality with certain standard, set, pack, whatever you want to call it, but it's a challenge every single time. You don't even start to play for real. And that is not good in real life, because life is exactly the same. And this can give you that's why military history gives you a wholly different existential take on reality, because it shows you how many things you thought could be useful are actually useless, and how there are many others that we constantly overlook. First of all, the limits of human mind that we don't even want to recognize, to acknowledge. And I hope really to expand on this topic, because there is so much more to say. Today was just a bit of a rant as usual, but be mindful of this, and just know that in the Von Clausewitz playlist we talk exactly about these things for what they are, right? And that's the purpose of that. So without these, any military historical interest properly meant is insignificant. That is, you can watch all the videos, the history videos you want, you can play all the Wargames, you can do a lot of other interesting stuff, but still, just know that the theory of it is here, is that it would just take to study that to get rid most of all the mistakes we constantly do in all these fields, and that we don't, because we underestimate what in warfare is literally the single most important thing, and therefore, not surprisingly, we don't understand warfare, human mind, moral resources. But alright, so for today I stop here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.